Welcome to this evening's lecture. My name's Nick Gallant, and I'll chair this evening. This is the third of our public lectures this year. I think the first one was Tuna Tassen-Koch from the University of Amsterdam, who was here in, I think it was October. We then had Francesco Chiardelli from the University of Turin, who spoke on informality in the housing sector. So, as I say, I'll introduce Claire in a moment, but most of you know Claire anyway. The program of lectures for the remainder of the year will include Franklin Obeng-Odum from the University of Helsinki, who will talk on land and political economy. Then we have Margaret Crawford, who will come from University of California in Berkeley in May to talk about her work on everyday urbanism. Anyway, the purpose of these public lectures, as you know by now, is to go off-piste a little bit from the normal course material and introduce to you the research that is happening in the wider world of planning. Often our speakers are from all over the world. It's very unsustainable bringing them here, of course, but tonight we've been very, very sustainable. And we're very fortunate to have Claire Colomb from the Bartlett School of Planning, who many of you will of course know, and some of you may be in her courses this year at the Bartlett School of Planning. So Claire, as it says there, is Professor of Urban Studies and Planning. Her work focuses on socio-political conflicts centered on urban development. And I can think of no greater socio-political conflict at the moment than those focused on the housing market, and particularly on the extraction of mainstream housing stock for short-term rentals. So this is the topic of Claire's talk this evening. I'll give her the floor in a moment. And normally at this point I say welcome to the Bartlett School of Planning, but I will dispense with that welcome this evening. So there will be opportunities to ask questions at the end. And obviously the great advantage of physically being here is that we have refreshments afterwards. So we will head to the Haldane room at the end of the lecture, where any conversations that are stunted by me as chair can continue over a glass of wine and a packet of Walker's crisps. Such is the budget restrictions at UCL at the moment. Anyway, enough from me. Welcome to this evening's lecture. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thanks everybody for joining on a winter night. You may have other things to do, so I'll try to entertain you. Talking about a research project that I've been doing with others. I will introduce my co-researchers in a moment for the past few years. And so I'm going to talk about the social conflict and the regulatory responses to short-term rental housing in the age of digital platforms. Before I tell you about the actual research project, I want to frame the object of study and explain why, not just for planners, but also for social scientists more broadly, it makes sense to study short-term rental as a frontier object that's at the intersection of three dynamics of socioeconomic change. The first of these dynamics you'll be familiar with is what has been called platform capitalism. It was initially called a sharing economy, but there's not much sharing left. And so most social scientists actually use the term platform capitalism now to refer to the emergence of digital companies that mediate between different market agents, between consumers and service providers or goods providers, and take a commission for this intermediation. And examples you will be very familiar with in the urban field have been transport platforms like Uber, in the field of short-term rental like Airbnb or VRBO, food delivery like Deliveroo, but also increasingly mediating urban services like TaskRabbit. And you can even now buy experiences, go and eat with strangers in their living room. And so there's a diversification of these new forms of platform capitalism. There's a lot of literature in economic sociology that has unpacked how these platforms work. Their value lies in the network effects, aggregating the largest possible number of users. And the other source of value is that they collect and accumulate a huge amount of data on our practices as consumers and as people who offer services or goods. And I'll come back to this because this is a crucial aspect of regulation. So these platforms have generated an emerging literature in geography, in urban studies, in planning, on so-called platform capitalism. As I said, they have had an impact on our consumption practices, on labor, the so-called gig economy and the precarity that comes often associated with them. There is an emerging literature on their impacts on cities, the use of space, the housing market. I'll come back to this, mobilities. But what we've been really interested in this project is their implications for urban governance, or governance at different levels. And we've initially been inspired by the work of American political economists who don't work on cities, who work on usually national regulations, and who've looked at how platform companies disrupt not just the economic sectors where they enter, but also the regulatory regimes that govern those sectors. And some of the very most inspiring work on this has been the work done by Kathleen Tellen at MIT on the comparative politics of Uber regulation in Europe and the US. But when we started looking at this, there was virtually no work on city-level regulations. So the emerging work was focusing on nation states. The second set of processes or dynamics of social and economic change that frame that object of study, short-term rental, is the broad body of work on urban tourism, new mobilities in cities, and the changing visitor economy that affects urban spaces. And here we have witnessed over the past 20 years changes pre-COVID, changes in transport, in information and communication technologies, that have massively increased the demand for urban tourism in cities that were not necessarily historic touristic cities. So in Europe, you have cities like Berlin or Barcelona that were off the tourist map 30 or 40 years ago that have now become prime destinations for all sorts of forms of tourism and visitor economies. And one of the things I'll return to also is that over the past 20 or 30 years, there has been an increasing blurring of boundaries between tourism and other forms of temporary migration or mobility in cities. So if you look at a city like London, at any point in time, you're going to have international students or exchange students who come for a few months. You're going to have so-called mobile professionals or creatives who are coming here for an assignment. You're going to have second homeowners or property investors who have a pied-à-terre in London, but also translocal migrants pre-Brexit who used to, for example, go back and forth between, say, Poland, Romania, and London several months a year. So it's no longer easy to distinguish, who is a tourist, who is not, who is a visitor, who isn't. And this has implications for housing markets because these temporary users need a place to stay and they need forms of accommodations that are flexible or temporary. And of course, when there's a need, there's immediately an appropriation of that need by new entrepreneurs. And so these transients, these increasing flows of visitors have been appropriated by platforms like Airbnb and others who've really seen the potential that this had to offer new forms of housing. And in that context, this has generated a very contested impact on cities, and there's a whole sort of vast literature, in particular in geography and tourism studies, on touristification or tourism gentrification that discusses the negative impacts and the social conflicts that the increase in visitor flows is generating for European cities. And in fact, my own interest in this topic came from work that I've done with Dr. Johannes Novi at Westminster University. We initially became interested in those conflicts by looking at social movements that were emerging in European cities around planning conflicts generated by tourism. So Berlin, Barcelona, Lisbon, and other destinations. Just to finish on this second trend that is shaping our object of study, I wanted to say a few words on how COVID has changed these mobility flows. You will all remember that we couldn't travel for about 2 years. There was very little international travel. And for a while, the use of short-term rental platform drastically diminished. But there was also, you will remember this, a huge discussion on urbanites who could afford it, who would rush to the countryside to spend the lockdown in an Airbnb in Wales, and new forms of domestic tourism. The growth of domestic demand, given international travel, was no longer possible. And some issues that have arisen just after the pandemic is obviously the long-term effect of changing geographies and sociologies of remote working on particular cities and regions. And so we know there are now huge pressures on many rural and coastal areas in Europe, in the UK, and in many other parts of Europe, with mobile middle classes who can work from home, who are more and more tempted to have two residences or to spend long periods of time, renting a short-term rental somewhere and working remotely. And this has been a salient issue also in the case of cities that have attracted so-called digital nomads, people who can take their MacBook and just go and stay in Prague for 3 months and work from a nice cafe there. And finally, the third set of transformation that the object of study, short-term rental, is located in. So I've mentioned changing mobilities, I've mentioned platform economy, is obviously the transformation of urban housing markets. And here there's a vast literature on how housing is part of broader processes of shift towards asset-based welfare, vast literature on financialization. And what we have done in reviewing that literature is review the work done by other colleagues. We haven't done that work ourselves to show how short-term rental play a role in those processes. And we know this because once we look at the aggregate data scraped from Airbnb, we can see there's an increasing share of multi-listings, property owners having several properties on the platform, and so no longer a single person renting their flat. And we also can see there's an increasing share of entire flats rented out the whole year. So it's not the home that you're renting out when you're going on holiday for 3 weeks. And so we see in many European cities how a growing share of the short-term rental market is operated by professional landlords. They can be small-scale amateur landlords who buy a few flats to complement their pension, for example. But they can also be increasingly multi-property landlords, or even, as some colleagues have shown in the case of Lisbon, real estate investment and wealth and asset management companies that are starting to enter this market. It's very difficult to actually monitor that, but there's evidence from colleagues who've worked on Southern Europe that these new types of investors are entering that market. And so short-term rental has really become something from an individual unregulated informal practice. You rent your room when you go away or your flat when you go away, to what has been referred to by Greek colleagues as large-scale strategic management of real estate property. And in that context, the latest sort of development in that broad literature has been the introduction of the notion of platform real estate. You may remember that we had Desiree Field in our public lecture series last year. She's really one of the leading authors developing this concept based on economic geography and economic sociology. And she and others argue that we really need to pay close attention to the increasing automation and digital intermediation of housing demand and supply, property management, real estate transaction and investments through all sorts of digital apps. So it's not just Airbnb and these kind of apps, but she shows in her work that you have had apps, for example, landlords use apps now to manage the relationship with their tenants, or you have, obviously we all use Zoopla and Rightmove when we look for a place. There are all sorts of credit checks that are done through apps. So all the actors in the housing market are now put in relation with one another through apps. And she and others are asking the question, what does this do to power a relationship between actors of housing and real estate markets? So we were quite inspired by this to, as you will see later, investigate the relationship between local authorities and platforms, and what the implication of this platform mediation of real estate relationship creates. So this is to give you the background on the three sets of academic debates we're trying to engage with in the project. In the middle of this, there's a new object called short-term rentals, and it's been extremely controversial. On this slide, I've tried to summarize what's both the political arguments, but also what we see in the literature says about the arguments in support of this new form of visitor accommodation and against. On the one hand, the supporters of short-term rentals argue that they democratize travel. It's cheaper to rent an Airbnb when you travel with a family in tow than go to a hotel, or it used to be. That it gives flexibility for guests, extra income for hosts who sometimes have difficulties paying their mortgage and their rent. It's a form of complementary income. There's also argument about the sociability for example, older people who open their flats and welcome guests. And there's a whole series of arguments, especially pushed by platform, that the territorial spread of tourist accommodation in new parts of the city where there are no hotels is good for the economy, and that it generates so-called trickle-down effects. That's the arguments in favor. But as you will know, there have been an increasing amount of arguments against these short-term rentals, with different authors talking about problems of security and safety, the disturbance to neighbor. If you do live in a building with a full-time Airbnb, you will know that you have noise, people coming in, coming out, parties, the noise of trolley suitcases. There have been a lot of work in the US on how the users and managers of short-term rental reproduce socioeconomic and racial inequalities with evidence of racial discrimination in market processes. There's a whole literature on tax evasion, the competition with hotels. Obviously, the hotel industry is up in arms because suddenly there's this big competitor. The loss of the initial spirit of sharing through the professionalization of that industry. And finally, and most importantly for the purpose of this lecture, the impacts that short-term rentals have on housing markets and the fabric of neighborhoods. And here in the project, we have not ourselves done an econometric measurement of the impact of short-term rental in the cities we looked at, but we reviewed all the literature and all the studies we could find of economists or geographers who've done that. And whilst there are complex challenges in actually measuring specifically the impact of short-term rental on housing market, because it's not that easy to separate that effect from other forces that influence housing prices, most of the scholars, solid scholars who've written on this show us that in high-demand cities that are popular with visitors, the growth of short-term rental over the past 10-15 years has led to a decline in the housing stock available for long-term occupation in popular neighborhoods, so in touristy neighborhoods, not everywhere in the city. And it has led to some increase in sale and rental prices in particular neighborhoods. So these effects are very uneven within the city, but they're very visible in some neighborhoods. And to give you an example, a Spanish colleague, Agustin Cocola, did research in the old city of Barcelona in the Barrio Gótico, where he found that in some streets, 50%, 50, of the resident population was evicted and displaced to make way for short-term rentals in some streets of the Gótico. So this is basically unbuilding a neighborhood in this instance, with implication for schools and shops and demand. So this is hopefully the context for the objective study is clear. So the research gap that we wanted to investigate was, how do city governments respond to that phenomenon? And our initial observation of a number of European cities showed us that the responses were very different, from no action to governments taking very strong and stringent regulatory measures to in-between cases. And so we were puzzled and wanted to understand and explain why there were those different approaches, but also what cities and city governments could do as a level of regulation, as opposed to national governments, which have been covered by other researchers. So the research questions that underpin the project are listed here. How has the issue of short-term rental become politicized? By whom? So the framing in political sociology terms. How do public actors seek to regulate short-term rentals and all the platforms? I'll come back to this. So through what policy sectors, through what instruments? How do we explain the differences between different cities' responses? What challenges arise for local authorities when implementing and enforcing the regulations? And you will see there are many challenges. And finally, what new relationship emerge between private digital platforms and public authorities? How do they relate to each other, and what kind of conflicts and collaborations emerge? So this has been an incremental and collaborative project, and I wanted to mention the people with whom I've worked on that project. As I said, it started with early work on planning conflicts in Barcelona and Berlin with my colleague Johannes Novi. It then sort of continued through a first exploration of the situation in 3 cities, Barcelona, Paris, and Milan, done with 2 colleagues based in France, Thomas Aguilera from Sciences Po Rennes and Francesca Artioli from the Urban Planning School at Paris Est. And then we received a small grant from the Property Research Trust to extend the study and cover 12 capital or second large cities in Europe, which you see listed here, with Tatiana Moreira de Souza, who is now working in Liverpool, but was previously here at the Bartlett School of Planning. And we are now in the final phase of the project where we're coding some of the qualitative data. I'll talk about this, and we're finishing to write a book. So I'm going to present basically the outcome of all these different waves of project. So just before I get into the results, the methods we've used were primarily qualitative, a lot of documentary analysis, reading court cases, reading regulations, a total, I think, over 7 or 8 years of 100 semi-structured interviews in 9 countries. We've done a lot of non-participant observation. We were even allowed to follow inspectors for a day, an enforcement team, to do a sort of, ethnography of the state in action and see what kind of techniques Airbnb hosts were utilizing to escape enforcement. But we've also done a lot of participant observation because in the course of the project, we've often been asked to present evidence to different city governments, to housing activists. And so on the one hand, we would go to these meetings and talk about this, but on the other, we could also observe the dynamics of conflicts and discussions in particular spaces at some points in time. And in the final phase of the project, I'll briefly talk about it. We've used light quantitative methods because we've tried to create an index of regulatory intensity to try and capture the intensity of regulation of the phenomenon, and possibly find explanation for differences in the intensity of regulation. So just to clarify what we mean when we talk about short-term rentals, here you have the official definition by the Court of Justice of the European Union. But for analytical purposes, we distinguish between 3 different types, and it really matters because the different forms of regulation make this distinction. But it matters because when we talk about the contested impact on the housing markets, this is really this first type that actually has an impact on the housing market, technically speaking. So the first type are effectively professional holiday lets, flats that are completely taken out of the housing market and they're used whole year round as short-term rentals. And these are the ones that have an impact on the housing stock. The other 2 practices are what Airbnb initially intended when it talked about the sharing economy. It was you renting your flat for a couple of weeks when you go on holiday, or you renting a room in your flat when you're present. So home sharing in a traditional sense. And so there's some ambiguity when we talk about short-term rentals because we can be moving across these 3 practices, but in terms of housing, the controversial one is really the first category. So the first finding of the project, when we started doing interviews in our cities, is that the politicization and framing of short-term rental as a public problem mobilizes a total of 7 types of actors and interest groups in Europe, apart from local authorities. And in this little diagram, we've tried to show the different social and economic interest groups that mobilize around the issue. So on the one hand, we have professional short-term rental operators and property managers, often represented by a professional association, and they mobilize the right to free enterprise, the right to freely use one's property, and as an argument to defend their practices. We have, on the other side, the hotel industry that constantly complains about unfair competition. So the narrative they use is this is unfair competition. We have the right to operate in a fair and competitive market. These competitors need to be regulated like we are. We have platforms and host associations. I'll come back to who these are. They're basically loose networks of people who rent out their home on Airbnb. And platforms and these associations defend the right to travel, the right to mobility, the right to share. This is an official expression that's been used by Airbnb in some of their marketing. And finally, we have residents association, housing activists, tourism-related movement, who focus very much on the disturbance to housing market and to daily life. And the rights they mobilize are the right to peace and privacy, the right to stay put, the right to housing. So you can see that these competing social groups basically conceive short-term rental in different ways, as a residential unit, as a home that has to be protected, or as an economic activity. And some of them emphasize the market value of housing, others emphasize the use value of housing in the way they talk about that object. And so I won't tell you the story for the 12 cities, but just to illustrate how different those actors have mobilized in different cities, this just summarizes in our first 3 pilot cities who got involved around that issue first, and how they framed the problem. And it's very interesting to see that the framing was very different. So in Milan, for example, there was no problematization of short-term rental in terms of housing impact. It is not framed this way. It is not problematized this way. It was primarily the powerful hotel industry that started putting pressure for regulating the sector. And in Milan, the framing has been one of taxation. We need to avoid tax evasion and make sure that the revenues generated are taxed. But the housing question has been pretty absent from the debate. This is the contrary in Paris and Barcelona, where housing has been very strongly used in the Paris rationale. And in Paris, the main actor has been this gentleman here, who is the deputy mayor for housing from the Communist Party in a coalition with the socialists, who's made it his own battleground to regulate professional short-term rental, which he argues are removing desperately needed housing from the Paris housing market. And in Barcelona, the framing really came from social movements, and in particular the anti-touristification social movement that initially framed this in relation to a critique of tourism and eventually turned this into a housing problem. So this is just an example to show you how the problem is politicized in different ways by different actors and to different degrees. So let's move to regulation. What exactly is being regulated when we look at this? And I think it's helpful to think about two objects of regulation. On the one hand, you have the short-term rentals themselves, and they are ambiguous. On the one hand, they are a housing unit, so they are physical land or building use, but they're also an economic activity, a business. And the way you regulate these two things, the land use and the business, is different, and you will use different policy instruments. But then you also have the platforms that mediate short-term rentals, and they are more difficult to regulate. They are transnational corporations, and you will see a little bit later how challenging it has been to get them to do what local authorities want them to do. So to capture the diversity of regulation, we spend a lot of time with Tatiana in the 12 cities trying to capture the data from the 12 cities in a systematic way. And we came up with these very detailed tables that are in a report that's online, where in each city we capture the regulation for each of the three types of short-term rental. In a great level of detail, I won't enter into this. I can get back to this in the question time. But that effectively allowed us to have a quite precise and comparable view of 12 sets of regulation for three types of short-term rentals, basically. And if we try to summarize broadly what aspects of short-term rental are being regulated, we can see that there are different dimensions. On the one hand, many cities have tried to make this practice visible. It used to be informal, and very often it used to be in a gray area. They were not properly legally defined. So many cities have created registration scheme. You have to simply sign up for a registration number and declare your short-term rental in different categories. Some cities, I'll come back to this, have used a licensing scheme. So you need planning permission or a business authorization to actually operate a short-term rental. Other cities have used quality standards, so requirements for certain, fire or health regulation in the flat. Some cities have used planning and zoning mechanism to affect the location and the quantity. I'll come back to this. And many cities have used tools to try and distinguish between professional short-term rentals and temporary ones. So one of the ways this has been done in London, for example, is to use a number of days as a threshold above which the occasional practice of renting a flat when you're on holiday is no longer occasional and is considered a business. So in London, it's 90 days. In Paris, it's 120. In Amsterdam, it's 30. And finally, the other aspects that are regulated is the taxation of the transaction or the income generated. And as I mentioned earlier, the platform, the practices of the platform. One aspect that we didn't look at in great detail, but it's worth mentioning, is in many countries there are private housing regulation, for example, condominium laws or co-property laws in France, which also have a bearing. So in many parts of Europe, you need the authorization of the other landlords of the building to actually operate a short-term rental in theory. So just to zoom on planning, out of the 12 cities that we studied, 6 used planning and zoning mechanism to try and influence the geography and the quantity of short-term rental, and 6 others didn't. And I've mentioned here the 6 that have used different tools. I can go back to these in details in the questions, but this is primarily done by a mix of zoning plans that look like this, with zones where short-term rental are completely prohibited or their quantity is limited, as the case in Lisbon, combined with a system of planning permission or license. Usually this is more or less how it works. There are variations between these. But so all those cities are cities where the government took the view that you needed to utilize tools to actually control the quantity and the location in certain neighborhoods. The other 6 cities didn't intervene in that aspect, and their regulations were not about limiting the quantity and the location. We have found that across our 12 cities, regulations emerge from very different policy domains, so not just planning. Planning and housing was one, but some cities use tourism regulation, others business licensing, taxation, local taxation. And if we have to sort of summarize the diversity, we really have, and I will illustrate this in a moment with diagrams, a diversity between some cities who've regulated very little, Prague, Milan, and Rome in our sample, cities that have regulated theoretically in a very strict manner, Barcelona, Lisbon, Amsterdam, and Madrid, and all the others that are somewhere in between, trying to find a compromise between allowing you to occasionally rent your flat on Airbnb when you go on holiday, but at the same time trying to make it more difficult for professional holiday let to spread. So a sort of middle ground, if you want. So in order to try and quantify this a little bit better, we've created an indicator of regulation, which what we did is we took the different modes of regulation that I've already mentioned. Some are about restricting access to the market of short-term rentals, some are about framing the operation of the market. And we, for the 12 cities, created an indicator where we coded the absence or presence of this instrument for the 3 types of short-term rental. So each city can have an index of regulation ranging from 0 to 36. 0 if none of these tools are used, 36 if all these mechanisms are used for the 3 different types of short-term rental. This is crude. This is not particularly subtle, and we've had long discussion with political scientists, quant colleagues who trashed our index. But I think it's helpful to get a sort of broad sense, at least, of this idea of different intensities of regulation. So this is a little bit what we found. This is the frequency of instrument used across 12 cities. For example, in all cities, short-term rental are banned in social housing. That's one instrument of regulation. In many cities, they are subject to the tourist tax or a registration scheme. And on the right, you can see the instrument which are used much less across our sample of cities, like spatial and quantitative restriction. And if you try to see how it maps out in terms of regulatory intensity, this is the output of our aggregate score of regulatory intensity. And this is a snapshot a year ago. So I specify this because in some cities there have been some changes in regulations. And you can see that the cities that have the highest regulation index are Lisbon, Barcelona, and Amsterdam, and the less regulated one are Rome, London, and Prague. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to explain that, and we thought, okay, what does the literature tell us about the possible reasons for these different approaches to regulation? And so we went back to some of the literature we had looked at the beginning of the project, and we had the tourist geographers telling us, oh, if there are more tourists in your city, probably there will be more conflict and more regulation. Then we looked at the housing literature that told us that certain housing systems were probably more conducive to conflict and regulations. And we also hypothesized that whether the local government is left-wing or right-wing, and whether there are strong social movement pushing for regulation could have an influence on this index of regulatory intensity. So I'm not going to go into detail, but what we did is we basically tested each of these hypotheses in very simple, not very complicated bivariate analysis, to try and see if some of these hypotheses were correct. So I'll just summarize the findings without entering into the details. So we checked if cities that had more tourists per inhabitants and more Airbnb per inhabitants regulated more, and we found a weak correlation. It's not a necessary or sufficient condition for regulation to happen. We've tested whether tenure structure mattered, so whether cities of private tenants or with social housing have stricter regulations, and cities of homeowners have less regulation. And it's not always the case. There are exceptions, so it doesn't work as an explanation. We have then also used the question of affordability. We thought, okay, the more unaffordable the city in the private rental sector, probably the more likely the city government will want to intervene in that market. And again, no correlation. We've used the work of Sonia, who is sitting here, and the housing system, the welfare housing system that Sonia and others have developed in her book. And we also try to place our case on this. And basically, Sonia, this is fresh from the press from you. We found that we thought, okay, there may be stricter regulation in social democratic system and less regulation in liberal countries. And actually, no, it doesn't work. The cities in Southern Europe are both the least and the most regulated. So we have the two extreme cases between Spain and Italy. And in social democratic and cooperative system, we have medium to strict regulations. And finally, local politics does matter. Generally, left-wing government regulate more strictly, but not always. So it's not the sole factor. And the same with social movements. If there are active social movements that politicize the topic, there tends to be stricter regulation, but it's not very conclusive and not super clear. So no clear hypothesis. And so what we are trying to do now, and this is underway, so I won't present it, is we are trying to use another technique called qualitative comparative analysis to create path trajectories of conditions that combine to create certain regulations. So I want to finish in the time that remains by talking about the challenges of implementation and enforcement. The index we built is built on the theoretical strengths of a regulation, but it doesn't tell us anything about how it's implemented. And so, as anyone who's worked in planning enforcement will know, no regulation is as good as the means and the resources you have to enforce it. So if you can't enforce, your regulation is not very helpful. And so we spent quite a lot of time both in the interviews and in discussions with inspectors and local authorities talking about, okay, how do you implement those regulations? And there's three huge sources of difficulties. The first is regulating without data, and I'll explain this. The second are difficulties with physical inspection in the physical world, in the real world of cities. And the third is that the platforms and the operators of short-term rentals have been very active in contesting and sending the regulations to court and fighting the attempts at regulating their practices all the way to the EU level. So there is now the conflict that started locally is now taking place at the EU level. So first, regulating without data. In a nutshell, the private platforms do not want to give the precise listings of who is putting a flat on Airbnb or any other platform to the local authorities who ask for the listing. So you cannot really regulate and enforce a planning regulation if you don't know who is renting a flat where, and if you don't have the data to actually identify the unit you're trying to regulate. So it's a very, basic James Scott seeing like a state problem. If you don't see the objects you're trying to regulate, and if you can't visualize it, it's very difficult to regulate it. So there have been what Lily Hoffman and Barbara Schmitter have called in a book that's about the US data wars between city governments and large platforms. And in the US, New York City and San Francisco battled for years through court cases, very high-profile court cases, with Airbnb in particular, to obtain listings of who is renting properties on the platform, and eventually obtain those listings. But it took many years, and it was a very tense process. So in our sample, what we found is that only Barcelona and Paris managed to obtain incomplete data listings from large platforms with proper names and address of who is putting a flat on those. That took a very long time. There was a lot of conflict. Other cities are embroiled in court cases to try and get the same data. And so what was really an interesting finding, and we've just finished a paper on this with Tatiana, is that many city governments use what we called DIY methods of data assembly. They were really, struggling, saying, okay, the platform doesn't want to give us the data. How do I know what's happening in my local authority? And so in the interviews, we've heard that some of them hired computer programmers who could do data scraping for them. So data scraping is when you use a code to harvest and milk all the data of a platform automatically. You put this in an Excel sheet, and then you do detective work to try and find out, who is Fanny, 25-year-old, renting a flat in Islington Upper Street with green curtains. That's literally what it is. We've also heard that some cities are actually using or mobilizing data activists, in particular the activist project Inside Airbnb, which is a non-profit activist project run by Mary Cox, So he's been asked by city government to help. And some cities that have a little bit more funding have commissioned a data analytics firm like Talk and Code in London, I think Camden has used them, or AirDNA. And so there's an interesting politics of how do you make do to get the data you need to do your planning enforcement. And this matches some emerging trends in the UK in particular that have been described by other authors. For example, on the use of predictive software or private consultants to monitor HMOs in English local authorities. So the second problem that I mentioned is physical enforcement on the ground. And here, what we heard in interviews was not so different from what have been long-standing problem of controlling illegal housing or housing that is unfit for human purposes. So the stories you hear about inspecting HMOs, houses in multiple occupation, or cracking down on unhealthy or unfit housing, there were similar stories that we heard. And when we did follow the inspector for a day, it was an enlightening experience because it's very difficult to get inside the building. People don't answer the bell. If you've used an Airbnb, probably the landlord has told you, so if somebody rings the bell, you don't answer, or you say you're my friend. That's the classic strategy of avoidance of detection. We've heard all sorts of stories of how Airbnb landlords who operate a flat illegally are trying to cover their activity by asking guests to behave in certain ways. And so there were really interesting stories of how the everyday state and inspectors were using very informal practices, talking to the neighbors and listing the spying grandmother to sort of keep an eye on what was going on, and all sorts of stories of a completely DIY, really informal, way of enforcing, which is so far removed from the technology that the platforms are using. And the final and most interesting findings that we didn't expect at the beginning that explains the difficulties with enforcement is how digital platforms have responded to attempts to regulate the market that they operate. And the argument we're trying to make in the book is how platforms are becoming a new urban political actor, not just a national political actor, but really urban political actors engaging with bargaining and negotiation with city governments. So in all the interviews we've done, we realized that the platforms basically play divide and rule. They concede certain things to a city government and they refuse it to another. So there's a sort of constant, bilateral politics between a platform and a city government that is different from what's happening in another city. And platforms have played an active role in urban politics in multiple ways. They've behaved as regulatory entrepreneurs. This is an expression by legal scholars, Pullman and Barry. And they've done this in multiple ways. So they've used strategies of collaborations. For example, the cities you have here, Amsterdam, Paris, Milan, Lisbon, and Rome, now have a tax collection agreement with Airbnb. So when you book an Airbnb in this city, the tourist tax is collected directly by the platform and given to the city. Airbnb has actually published a public policy document telling City Council, we wrote the policy for you, this is how we want to be regulated. And so it's a very enlightening document, it's called the Policy Tool Chest, and they literally say, here are the rules, please apply these rules to us. And so you have effectively a private company writing the policies they want to see applied to themselves. You may have seen advertisements in public transport or on Facebook or in the newspapers by Airbnb. These are different examples. This was a very controversial advertisement in San Francisco in 2015 when Airbnb was spending millions to derail a referendum that was about regulating short-term rentals. And they funded this advertisement to show that the revenue generated by the tax imposed on short-term rental was funding public libraries. The arguments that you have seen in some campaigns, this was in Paris, is that short-term rentals are helping individuals to pay for their dreams, to pay for their study, to pay for the first movie in this instance, or their shoe collection. And this is the latest advertisement of Airbnb, like 2 or 3 weeks. I've very recently seen it in Paris, where Airbnb is actually saying, oh, we are accepting new regulations, we're good guys. So they've actually done an advertisement to say, we accept that short-term rentals should be limited to 120 days a year, and we'll make sure we are complying. So there are recent attempts at showing a gradual acceptance of some form of regulation. And the most important strategies that platforms have used, in particular Airbnb but others, has been very well studied in a brilliant piece of work done by Luke Yates in Manchester, who is a sociology colleague. He has interviewed former employees from Airbnb who no longer work there. and shown with others that the platform is actually mobilizing its users, so the users of Airbnb, and trying to encourage them to form home sharing clubs, which are informal associations, to fight against regulations. And these techniques of astroturfing have been used by Uber. There's also some similar work on Uber. And some American political scientists have been looking at this and call this platform power. And to show you what it looks like, this is a letter that Airbnb has sent to hosts and users of Airbnb in Barcelona. This was forwarded by a Barcelona friend. That letter was sent in 3 languages, in English, Spanish, and Catalan. In 2015, when the Barcelona mayor was trying to crack down on short-term rental, and it says, Catalan hosts welcome blah, blah, blah in their guests. So it's all about how good for the city's economy it is. In its recently published urban plan, Barcelona City Hall favors big tourist firms over regular citizens. Meanwhile, the government is planning to introduce burdensome restrictions for people that want to share their home. And, it sort of criticizes this regulatory attempt. And at the end, it says, take a moment and email your elected official to stand against this legislation and help support home sharing. And then the link takes you directly to the email inbox of local city politicians. And so that was said. That's an example of this mobilization technique. So the final method that's been used by platform has been to send city governments that are too restrictive to court. And so there have been a huge number of court cases in front of regional, national, or even now the European Court of Justice between large platforms and city governments. Barcelona, Madrid, Berlin, Paris, for example, are all embroiled in court cases. And so there's a really strong politics of contesting city government's right to regulate for public interest objective, and what some of us have called a judicialization of public policies by these ordinary forms of judicial control. And what has been interesting, and this is also something we didn't expect at the beginning, and we've had to read quantities of EU legislation that have nothing to do with planning, is that in those court cases, platforms use certain pieces of EU law which have nothing to do with planning or housing to try and stop city government from taking regulation. And I won't enter into detail, and I can talk about this in the question. They use, in particular, the e-commerce directive, the services directive, to actually argue that local government do not have the right to restrict the operation of a business in the European free market, in the European single market. And this has gone all the way up to the Court of Justice of the European Union, that in an important court case has actually argued that, yes, local regulation of short-term rental can be allowed and are not incompatible with the single market if there are overriding reasons related to the public interest. So the battle is about what is the public interest. And they've argued in their court cases that protecting the long-term housing stock is in the housing interest, is in the public interest. So there is, if you want, a favorable judgment by the European Court of Justice, but all the battle is about what is proportionate in meeting or in protecting this public interest. So what started as a local political conflict is now a very complicated EU judicial battle on the meaning of the public interest, the meaning of what it is to be proportionate in your response to it. And a lot of local authorities, as you can imagine, are pretty lost and don't necessarily have the legal knowledge to navigate and defend their regulatory attempt. And so just to finish on this, what it has meant, and this is something that happened as we were doing the project, is that more than 20 European city leaders and mayors have started a network in 2016 to exchange experience on short-term rental regulations and to make their voice heard at the EU level to counteract what platforms were actually telling the European Commission. So there have been a very heavy politics of lobbying and influence going on at EU level. And this network of mayors, London is part of that, have basically asked the European Commission to try and change EU regulations so that platforms have an obligation to share data with public authorities effectively. This is unlikely to happen. There have been lots of discussions, and for the moment, the signs are not moving in this direction. So to conclude, I hope that I have shown you that short-term rental as a public problem has been politicized in very different ways in different cities. Different types of regulation have emerged via different policy domains and are more or less stringent. Enforcement efforts do matter, they're not irrelevant. I didn't talk about this, but we've asked some city governments if they were happy about some of their enforcement efforts, and some cities did manage to crack down on illegal short-term rental and put a number of flats back on the market, but at a very high cost. And all of the cities told us that it's impossible to enforce without cooperation from the platforms, and access to data from the platform is absolutely key to public policy and regulatory enforcement. So you could say that it's a classic planning conflict. The regulatory choices that involve trade-off between the freedom to use one's property and the exchange value of a property versus the protection of the public interest. There's nothing new. This is what the essence of planning is about. There's also a sort of trade-off between the right of local resident, whatever this means in an era of mobility, versus the right to mobility of tourists and visitors. But we would argue that this classic planning conflict has a twist, and the twist comes from the digital platforms as the new political actors in urban governance and in local planning regulation. And here the challenge is really, how do you govern without data? How do you regulate without data or with imperfect data? And we are at the moment trying to think about, what do we wish to say about this, and about the transformation of the state, the local state in particular, in an age of algorithm and big data, and what it does to state capacity. I just wanted to, Tatiana, my co-author, isn't here, but I just wanted to mention that we were very happy to receive the RTPI Sir Peter Hall Award, in particular because we've tried to disseminate the research to a lot of public authorities and community groups. So we've tried to, as much as possible, help shape policy discussions in the UK, in Europe, in Paris and other places about this. And I wanted to also mention that with Nick, who is sitting here, we've just got a little bit of funding to venture a little bit off track and look at short-term rental regulation debate in rural and coastal areas. You will know it's a major issue in big parts of England and the UK. It's also a big issue in France. So hopefully in the coming months, we'll do a little bit of work with Murray Cox from Inside Airbnb to try and study the impact and the controversies of short-term rental on Cornwall, the Cotswold, Brittany and Burgundy. You can see we're planning our holidays at the same time. And if I have time, I thought that given we have some practitioners in the room, I can see Duncan and others, I would just finish by mentioning, for those of you who are not familiar with the UK context, where do we stand in the UK in terms of short-term rental regulation? And so in a nutshell, there's very little regulation in England and new regulation in Scotland and Wales. So different speeds of travel. Scotland has recently passed 2 new pieces of law, one on allowing local authorities to create control areas through the planning system. Like Edinburgh has been the first one to approve their scheme, where in those areas, any property operating as a short-term rental needs to apply for planning consent and can therefore be refused planning consent. A similar legislation is being prepared in Wales, and in Wales there's consultation about this, which is tied up to the question of second home. So the regulatory discussion and the tax discussion, we can maybe discuss this with Nick in the debate, is really bundling together the question of how do you use the planning system to try and restrict the proliferation of second home and short-term rentals, which are sort of related. And in England, the situation at the moment is that there's effectively very little possibility of regulation outside of London. And in London, specifically, the UK Deregulation Act of 2015 currently allows anyone to rent out their home for maximum 90 days a year without planning permission. If you do this more than this amount, in theory, you need planning permission. And that act theoretically allows local boroughs, local councils to apply to the Secretary of State for an exemption from this 90-day rule. So Westminster City Council, which is really affected by short-term rental, has tried to do this, and they were refused and rejected. So far, central government has not allowed London boroughs to use that clause. But you will know that this may change. The Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, in its section 2010, has actually proposed the possibility of setting up a national registration scheme for England of short-term rental, and this responds to a call for evidence that the DCMS did in the autumn, and to also a report that the House of Lords Built Environment Committee published advocating the creation of such a scheme. So it's a policy area that might be moving pretty fast in England in the coming months, and certainly an area of strong debate in England at the moment. I'll leave the recommendation for the question time, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. I mean, so comprehensive on every aspect of the topic. I actually can't believe there could possibly be any questions, although I'm sure there will be. So who would like to ask one first? Duncan.
Since I've just mentioned, Duncan Barry. I thought that was brilliant, I have to say, and I've been waiting for something like this for a long time, because in the London context, historically, the three successive mayors have not wanted any form of intervention at all, because it would get in the way of tourism promotion. And that, in a sense, has been a critical constraint. I mean, also, clearly, the mayor doesn't have regulation powers. And in fact, I was surprised in the sense that you actually got up to 2 points for London on your scale, which I assume refers to
the
HMO enforcement, which is generally very weak, because the private rental sector is otherwise completely deregulated. And possibly the other bit was selective licensing schemes operating in a number of authorities, which are focused primarily on quality and mismanagement rather than necessarily on who's in the property in terms of short-term lets. I'm also, I mean, my memory is correct, it was up to 2000, there was a planning restriction of 30 days before, in terms of planning consent for short-term lets. So it's interesting that that has been liberalised over a number of years. But I mean, I'm just interested in the kind of policy recommendations, because clearly the mood is beginning to change, because how serious the impact of short-term lets in London has been. And I'm very interested that you're moving on to some of the seaside towns where the problem is in a sense, even more acute in terms of the proportions. So I'm just wondering if it's in the British context, or specifically the London context, what form of regulation and taxation? Because I think having a tourist tax in London is essential and long overdue, and that would actually act as a control in the way it's being used in Paris. So I'm just interested in what recommendations you're likely to come up with.
Yeah, so what we did is we with Tatiana Morer, we wrote a response to the DCMS consultation, and we basically summarized on the basis of what we had observed in Europe, what needs to be done under three main points. One, very simple, is give planning authorities the power to set up licensing schemes, designate special areas of control with planning consent, as is done in Wales or Scotland. So in a way that the way has been paved by the developed nation. But of course, that only works if you have resources for monitoring and enforcement. And here, there's the broader question of the impact of 1 decade of austerity on planning departments. So we interviewed some London boroughs, and they told us we have 2 inspectors for the whole spectrum of housing illegalities. And when we have somebody complaining about a short-term rental and somebody saying there are people who are at threat of dying of a CO2, of a defect in a gas boiler, and human life is at risk, we will definitely always choose the dramatic case of slum landlords. And so effectively, there's no power of enforcement. So quite obviously, this is the first area of action. The second area comes from the question of platform data. Local authorities can't regulate if they don't have access to platform data. Given the UK is no longer in the European Union, only a law of parliament could force platform to release the data. The only country in Europe that has done this is France, where the national parliament has now passed a law that makes it compulsory for platforms to release the data to big cities over 250,000 inhabitants that have a registration scheme. And platforms have had to comply. So basically, if the UK parliament passes a law forcing platforms to release the data, they would have to comply. And other countries like Greece have also done this, but they've done this for tax reasons. So it's their tax authorities that have forced platform to release data to verify whether the income is properly taxed. They were not so much worried about housing, they were worried about tax. And the third area of action, and this is really Nick's ideas here, we've had a discussion in a paper we did recently, is taxation, as you said. there's a real need to use council tax, business rates in relation to second home and short-term rentals. And Nick has done a bit of work on the loophole that existed during COVID in particular, where people ambiguously moved their second home into the short-term rental, vice versa, in order to benefit for some tax loopholes, and also the business support scheme that the government created during the COVID lockdown. So there was a lot of weird things going on, and we've talked a little bit in a recent paper. So taxation, local taxation, apart from the tourist tax, which you mentioned, which is a separate topic, is really important.
Okay, I'll take some more questions. Obviously, I just wanted to say that the Welsh rules that you referenced came live in October, so there were changes to secondary instruments in Wales. So they do now have the power to block conversions, changes of use to second homes or holiday lets. I was alerted to that fact by a local authority officer whose email to me was, "We'll never be able to enforce this." For the reasons that you've set out. Mike, yeah.
Thanks, Claire. And I've watched the work evolve over the last few years. It's wonderful to see where it's gone. I've been privileged to watch it emerge across the corridor, actually. So, one thought I had was, I was just thinking about Joe Penny's work. He was here, thinking about how local governments, with some problems, have actually tried to set up their own organisations and companies to do things with indifferent results quite often. I just wondered if any of the authorities here had thought about setting up their own Airbnb, because of course there are huge issues around underuse, there are enormous environmental issues about new build. And so is there a more progressive potential in that digital capitalism that maybe local authorities or even third sector organisations, environmental groups and others, housing groups, could use that kind of technology for progressive ends and try and capture some of the value that's out there for public policy? I know this is...
Don't give them ideas, mate.
I just wondered if that was being discussed anywhere in your...
Yeah, that's a good point. So as far as we know, no local authority has set up their own municipal schemes, but some of them have encouraged alternative initiative like Fairbnb, which is an attempt at creating a different model. And Fairbnb, which is being tested in Bologna and in a few other, in Amsterdam, I think, is based on the principle that only primary home can be advertised. So when you go on holiday for a few weeks or room, not a housing unit that's no longer a first residence, and that the fee, the transaction fee, part of it is reused for community or neighborhood projects. So that's kind of the idea. But that's, for the moment, has not taken off very broadly. It's only tested in a few cities. What we did here is that some local authorities tried during COVID to create a financial incentive to get landlords to return the flats to social housing. So in Lisbon, there was an experiment, and in Paris, and it hasn't worked very well. 300 or 400 flats were returned. The third thing I should say is there are a number of cities, mostly with left-wing mayors, so Vienna, Barcelona and others, who are part of a border network or sharing cities, the Sharing Cities Network. And they have committed to use platform technologies in their open source version, in their non-profit version, to support different forms of sharing and exchange economies, non-profit. So the cities in that network, Vienna is one of the pioneering cities on this. Vienna and Paris have done an enormous amount of work. They have an entire department in the city council that has developed apps to facilitate non-profit exchanges between citizens, not so much in housing, but in things like you trade skills. So, you have like a non-profit skills exchange where you need help with DIY. Somebody will come to the gardening. Citizens can trade goods. So there are some municipal government that are really taking the lead in keeping the spirit of the original sharing economy, but not so much in housing, in other fields like transport or goods or services or mutual help schemes or things like that.
Great. Danielle.
We should graph of cities and regulation mentioned that was a year old and things are changing. And things obviously are in some state of flux, and with the Sharing Cities network. Is there evidence that cities are learning from one another? Is there convergence in regulation? And I also wondered whether the somewhat weak correlations you showed between certain aspects, whether they're likely to strengthen over time as regulation changes?
Yeah, that's a good point. So cities do talk to each other in this network. Sorry, I was trying. Well, so this network of cities was set up in 2016 in Barcelona at a meeting I attended. And actually, the reason I got interested in this project is I was asked to do a little study for them at the beginning to try and get them to understand each other's regulation, and then they went their own way and continued. So this network of cities now have informal meetings where either technical staff in the planning department talk to each other in Zoom meetings, and they've had a few meetings with mayors and deputy mayors. So there's definitely exchange of experience. They also quickly realized that their entry points were very different, because some of them have, so the competencies that city governments have vary enormously in Europe. So they always like to hear what the other does, but very often it was like, yeah, but you, Berlin, you're a city state, you can do this, we can't, as a British local authority, for example. So there was always a question of how applicable what happens in one place is in another. That's one thing. But the reason they got together was first to exchange, but now because they also wanted to really speak with one voice at the EU level. Do regulations change? Yes. And here there is a process of looking at what others are doing, not necessarily the detail. But for example, in Spain, Barcelona was the pioneering city in 2015. The progressive Madrid government at the time that had also won the election, when we went to interview them, they said, we're going to do like what Barcelona did, and we'll do it our own way. And they had local variations, but there was a clear effect of we want to do the same. And finally, there are cities which so far were very liberal, very laissez-faire, and you can clearly see some social movements that are emerging. So in Prague, there is now a very, very active social movement of young people in Prague 1 in the historic district. In Rome and Milan, there are now emerging social movements. And so their citizens are much more in demand of regulation. But in Prague, it was very interesting basically to hear that we interviewed the deputy mayor for housing, who comes from the Pirate Party, which is a new Czech party that is sort of on the left, and it's not very clear. But he basically said that he was very sensitive to the argument of the social movement. They wanted to regulate, but the Czech parliament would not allow Prague City Council to regulate, because in the mind of Czech MPs, after 40 years of communism, you cannot do anything that touches the right to use your private property. And so really there you could see the sort of anxiety about intervening in private property after many decades. And so there are pressures for change, but there are, specific reasons like the Prague case where it might not happen for a long time because of historical reasons.
Okay, I've spotted a couple more questions. Question at the back. Yeah. Yeah. That's it.
Thank you for the presentation. I had a question regarding police quality. So I used to live in Amsterdam, and it felt like every neighborhood was everyone's favorite neighborhood. And that Airbnb, it was like the neighborhoods that were already under a lot of rental pressure, already going through a lot of gentrification, they were also subject to more popularity for Airbnb. So were there specific areas within cities that you're finding this was more pervasive, or like any kind of relationship with place quality?
Yeah, no, so there is indeed, this we've primarily done by looking at the maps produced by inside Airbnb or by the work of others, and there's a clear correlation between already gentrifying or gentrified neighborhoods or neighborhoods which are popular with visitors. There's definitely some strong overlap. They're not randomly distributed. This being said, in a lot of cities, because it's become quite lucrative to, rent out your flat or another flat on Airbnb, there has been clearly a spread of these new short-term rental in areas which previously were not so popular with visitors. And in some cases, that also includes, previously a traditionally working-class neighborhood that are not yet considered trendy, simply because some tourist destinations have become very expensive, and the sort of typical EasyJet backpacker wants to save money, and they don't mind going quite far away. So there have been in some cities a sort of filtering effect to the more peripheral areas, which is not necessarily hugely significant. This is not where the bulk of the offer is, but that marks a change from previous flows of accommodation. But you're very right in saying that in a city like Amsterdam and Lisbon and Barcelona, it's been superimposed on existing geographies of gentrification quite clearly.
Okay, we're going to take 3 more questions. Something's just flown into my head, actually. The leasehold system in the UK. I mean, it's not replicated in Italy. I don't know about Spain. I suspect not. But the breach of lease for local authority leases is clearly an issue for Airbnb. And maybe that breach of lease exists with some private leases as well. I mean, the law of forfeiture for leases, shouldn't local authorities identify a few people who've leased their flats via Airbnb without signing a deed of covenant and confiscate them? I mean, that would scare people like there's no tomorrow, yeah?
It's quite widespread in the council and such.
Yeah. So it's a breach of lease. They need to sign a deed of covenant every time they do an additional let, and without it, you can be subject to forfeiture. Yeah, okay. Anyway, just a minor point. Joe, firstly. Joe, and then Michael, and then Lucy.
Thanks so much, Claire. That was really amazing. Very inspirational for career scholars, I think, if you had to put together a huge piece of research. I was really struck by when I read Nick Cernicek's book on platform capitalism. He talks about the really spectacular rise of these huge companies, but also talks about their kind of systemic vulnerabilities. They're massively dependent on venture capital welfare, and also their business model relies on regulatory circumvention. Do you think that this form of platform urbanism has a future now that the times of cheap credit are kind of coming to an end, and also we've got this what looks like a kind of an arc of regulatory catch-up happening? Can they survive?
That's an interesting question. I think it would, we haven't thought about it yet, but my guess would be that it depends massively on the sector you're looking at, because the end of cheap credit, would have an impact on, for example, investors buying flats for the sole purpose of putting them on Airbnb. Clearly, that's going to have an impact. But whether it will have an impact on food delivery or other, areas, maybe not. Regulatory capture, yes and no. For the moment, at least in Europe, platforms are very well protected by EU legislation. So as long as this is not changed, the current system of the single market is relatively favorable to platforms. So at least in Europe, this would have to be changed for them to be seriously threatened, even though there have been slow changes. And the other thing which we all know is that, as capitalist innovations are very good at reinventing themselves. So Airbnb, for example, and other platforms have identified new markers during COVID and after COVID to try and make sure that they could continue to operate. So Airbnb, for example, they've made it very clear they wanted to reorient their offer in Europe to the domestic market, to countryside and peripheral areas. So they are very active now, advertising in little remote Italian and French villages and presenting themselves as a benevolent tool of local economic development, basically. And there are massive campaigns about this at the moment. And they are trying to avoid talking to the investors market, but more to local people who have a barn that they want to refurbish, and they can, subsidize the grandmother's pension fund. So that's kind of, in France is very clear in their latest campaigns. What they've also done is they've now started something new called Airbnb Experience, where you consume an experience, not just a place. And many platforms, we were told anecdotally during interviews, are now targeting the medium-term market, the Erasmus students who needs a 6-month contract, the digital nomad, which is posing new problems, because we've had housing activists in Barcelona telling us that this intermediary medium rent market doesn't fall on long-term regulation, and it doesn't fall under short-term regulation. It's the new gray area in some cities like Lisbon and Barcelona is the medium-term market. And housing activists are starting to become active on this.
Mike.
A quick comment and then a question. The quick comment is that we keep being deluged with information about the so-called smart city. But every time anything really tricky crops up like this, the data's private and not available.
Exactly.
Lots of examples, but it's just worth tracking them as they go past. The question is Britain, or London, I'm thinking of, is London unique among your cities in having these incredibly separate local government departments of housing and planning? I mean, in the GLA, it's a complete nightmare. It was visible couple of years ago when the Mayor of London set up his recovery task force stuff for post-COVID, which covered everything and did very interesting analysis about structural inequalities which led to incredible inequalities of impacts of COVID. But then the whole structure of his task force and his panels had no housing people on it at all. And we were told in a lecture the other day that the housing people just refused to play. They wouldn't join in.
I think we were supposed to have a senior housing rep from the GLA in the room. I don't know if he's here. Oh, that's you. So you can answer. So it would be great to have your insight. But Michael, to answer your question, yes, other cities in Europe have quite a strong separation, functional separation between housing and planning. So it was very clear in Paris. So, for example, the housing regulation and enforcement team was very busy taking action, whilst the local plan was being revised. And the people preparing the local plan had completely missed out that the new frontier for short-term rental conversion in Paris are ground floor shops and units that are shut down and transformed into ground floor short-term rental. And so you had this parallel attempt at cracking down through housing, ignoring that the problem was becoming a planning problem with retail and commercial areas. So it took a long time. We heard all these stories how these two teams were sort of not talking to each other, and only very recently they sat and realized that, they had to confront notes and start looking at the problem in a more global way. And we've heard this in other cities. So it's not a London problem. But would you like to say something perhaps about this?
It's Sam Hurst, well, the COVID recovery task force kind of relates my time with GLA, so they're trying to just anymore. So it wasn't around the formation of that. But I did hear just this week actually that the task force is looking to expand this remit in housing. So you may have your wish very soon.
But more generally, thinking about the Airbnb issue, more generally, both the organisation of the mayor's organisation is split like this. So is the London Assembly, which is supposed to scrutinise and evaluate what's happening. That has a housing committee and a planning committee, and they don't trespass on each other's territory. Very respectful of English. So there are questions you can't ask in either place.
I think we talk about things needing to be joined up in every policy domain in the UK, and that's the last thing that they are. But anyway, Lucy.
Yeah, fantastic lecture, really insightful, detailed, and the one area I felt kind of tantalised, wanted in more detail, it might be off the piece, and was around this idea that there was a local authority that had the opportunity and a legal hook, but was refused at Westminster. And I just wondered if you got a sense of the legal reasoning of that, or if that's something because I think where I'm reading across your data is interesting spaces of activism and potential regulation, and it's thought like some insight into how those are.
So I do not know. I don't know the reason why the Secretary of State refused that to Westminster. I haven't looked at the document. We interpreted it as a tension between a more regulatory council versus a deregulatory national government. And actually, that's a story we heard in many of our case studies. There's a clear disconnect between economically liberal national governments. This was very clear in France with the Macron government, very clear in the Czech Republic, very clear in Italy, very clear in Spain, versus local authority who tend to be usually having left-wing mayors who want to regulate. So there was a tension between local and national agendas in at least half of our case studies, where local government were trying to regulate against the opinion of their national government, and then depending on the degree of centralization, obviously England being very centralized, central government could derail the attempts. In other countries where local governments or municipalities have more power and autonomy, they could regulate against the opinion of national government. So there was a very clear multi-level governance conflict. I don't know if this answers your question.
Okay, I think we have an update from the GLA on this issue.
Yeah, I just want to say that I have the lenses on. I have request and the reply.
Great.
So share that. Interesting case though, because obviously Westminster Council at that time I think was Conservative.
Yeah, so you're right, so it was not. But it had a very active MP who she's been campaigning very actively, Karen Buck, on those issues. So, yeah.
I think we will draw things to a close. There are two things that we absolutely have to do at this stage. The first of those is the most important, and that is thank Claire again for an absolutely brilliant lecture. And I hope to see you all again at the next public lecture on the 15th of March, where we will welcome Franklin Obeng-Odum from the University of Helsinki, and he'll be talking on the issue of land and political economy from a Georgist perspective. So I think we might like that too. Great, thank you.